Before anything else unfolds, notice how the weight you carry rarely comes from a single event, but from accumulation, from the quiet layering of headlines, images, statistics, and unresolved human stories settling into the background of awareness, not as thoughts alone, as atmosphere. You may have sensed this already, the way global suffering no longer arrives as shock, but as a low, continuous hum, shaping mood, posture, breath, and expectation before conscious reflection ever begins. This is not indifference, it is saturation. When suffering becomes constant, the system adapts by compressing feeling, narrowing bandwidth, and shifting into a kind of emotional economy where care feels expensive and hope feels naive. And yet, beneath that adaptation, something else is happening. The stories you encounter do not remain outside you. They reverberate internally, forming loops of empathy without resolution, concern, without agency, recognition, without coherence. This is the echo chamber, not created by malice or ignorance, but by exposure without integration. Traditional responses often point outward from here toward solutions, policies, movements, fixes that promise relief somewhere beyond the self, while quietly leaving the inner fragmentation untouched. So the helplessness grows, not because nothing can be done, but because the system carrying the awareness is already overloaded. What rarely gets named is how this state itself becomes a condition, a default posture toward reality, where suffering feels permanent and separation feels factual. And in that posture, even compassion can feel heavy, like another demand placed on an already strained interior world. This is where the deeper question begins to surface, not how to solve suffering, but how suffering is being held, processed, and echoed through human systems that may not yet be oriented toward coherence. Because if suffering were only external distance, would protect you, but it isn't. It never was. Something else is moving beneath the noise, something quieter than despair and older than crisis, waiting to be noticed, not as an answer, but as a different ground entirely. And from that ground, the story begins to change. Once that internal saturation is acknowledged, something subtle shifts, because the feeling of overwhelm begins to look less like a personal failure and more like a response to fragmented perception. Not wrong, just incomplete. There is a quieter layer beneath the visible world, one that does not announce itself through events, but through patterns, through the way separation appears solid, until examined closely enough to soften. This is where the idea of universal coherence enters, not as comfort, but as context. In emerging physics, there is a growing recognition that reality behaves less like a collection of independent objects, and more like a continuous field of information where everything that appears separate is already in relationship, not metaphorically, structurally. Particles respond to conditions they are not. Locally touching systems synchronize without direct contact, and order arises, not through control, but through shared states that stabilize entire networks. The field does not need agreement, it responds to coherence. Ancient traditions spoke of this long before equations existed, describing an underlying unity that expresses itself as many while never truly dividing. Different languages, same recognition. What changes here is not belief, but orientation. Instead of asking how separate parts can be fixed, the attention shifts toward how coherence is lost, how resonance breaks down, how noise overwhelms signal inside complex systems. Suffering seen this way is not an enemy, but an indicator, a sign that coherence has thinned and fragmentation has become self-reinforcing. And when fragmentation dominates systems, compensate by tightening, simplifying, and protecting, which often looks like fear control or withdrawal at the human level. Universal coherence does not deny suffering, it contextualizes it. It suggests that beneath visible conflict, there is still a shared informational ground, still a field capable of reorganization when conditions allow for alignment. This is not optimism, it is structural humility, because coherence cannot be imposed. It emerges when enough elements within a system settle into compatible rhythms, allowing information to flow without distortion. You may notice how this reframes responsibility not as burden, but as participation, where every state contributes to the overall pattern without needing to carry the whole. And this is where the echo chamber begins to loosen, not because suffering disappears, but because separation no longer feels absolute and helplessness no longer feels like the only honest response. Something else becomes possible. Not yet action, recognition first. The sense that reality itself may be listening not to what is demanded, but to what is being embodied moment by moment across countless interconnected systems. And within that realization, a different doorway quietly opens. With that wider context now quietly present, the experience of interconnectedness stops being abstract and starts showing up somewhere more intimate, often before language has a chance to catch up. It registers first as a change in tone, not emotional intensity, but a softening in how the world presses against you, as if perception itself has shifted from sharp edges to gradients. This is important because coherence is not recognized through effortful thinking. It is detected. The body notices it before belief forms the nervous system, responding to patterns long before the intellect decides what they mean. You may notice moments when the sense of being inside yourself loosens, when boundaries feel more permeable, not dissolving, just less defended. Those moments rarely announce themselves as insight. They feel ordinary, almost forgettable, and yet they carry information. In physics, systems become coherent, not by adding energy, but by reducing internal conflict, allowing components to synchronize around shared conditions. Human perception follows a similar pattern. When internal noise settles even slightly, awareness expands without strain, and reality begins to feel less like something happening to you and more like something moving with you. This does not erase individuality, it reframes it. You remain distinct but no longer isolated, like a note discovering it belongs to a chord, rather than floating alone in silence. Ancient languages described this as remembering, not learning, a return to an orientation that was always implicit but overshadowed by survival-driven attention. What matters here is not agreement with the idea, it is recognition of the sensation. Because when coherence is felt even briefly, the question of separation loses urgency, and the problem of global suffering shifts from being an external catastrophe to an internal signal asking for attunement. This is where empathy begins to change shape, not yet as action, as perception. Empathy starts to feel less like effortful concern and more like resonance, a natural response, when boundaries soften and information flows without obstruction. You may notice how this kind of empathy does not drain, it steadies. It does not demand fixing or rescuing, because it is not trying to resolve from outside, but to stabilize from within the shared field of experience. This is subtle work. So subtle it is often overlooked in favor of louder gestures. But coherence does not advertise. It spreads quietly through states that invite synchronization rather than compliance. And this is why understanding alone is insufficient. You can agree with interconnectedness and still live as if you are separate, because coherence is not a position you hold, but a condition you inhabit. When the body is tense, when attention is fragmented, when identity contracts around threat, the field reflects that fragmentation back through experience, not as punishment, as feedback. And when even small moments of coherence arise, moments where breath deepens, attention steadies, and perception widens, the field responds in kind, amplifying what is already present. This is not mystical, it is relational. Systems respond to what they are given, and as this becomes noticeable, a quiet responsibility emerges, not heavy, not moralized, simply factual. The state you inhabit matters not because you control outcomes, but because you participate in conditions. From here, empathy is no longer just something you feel for others. It becomes something you are inside of. And that realization changes the conversation entirely. If empathy is no longer experienced as effort, then something fundamental has already changed. Because effort implies distance, and distance implies separation that must be crossed. Here, empathy stops traveling. It begins circulating. What most people call empathy is often a cognitive approximation, an attempt to imagine another's experience from the outside, which can be meaningful, but also exhausting because it relies on simulation rather than resonance. This is where empathy becomes heavy. But within a coherent framework, empathy behaves differently, less like an emotion you generate and more like a signal you receive and transmit simultaneously. In the field, information does not move linearly. It oscillates, synchronizes, and amplifies depending on compatibility between systems. Empathy, seen this way, is not something you send towards suffering, but something that arises when your state becomes receptive enough to register another's signal without distortion. This is subtle because it removes the heroism from compassion. There is no self-positioned above another, no rescuer stance, no performance of care. There is only alignment. When alignment occurs, understanding does not feel like imagining. It feels like recognition. You may notice how this kind of empathy carries clarity instead of overwhelm, because it does not absorb suffering into identity. It allows information to pass through. In physics, coherence allows waves to reinforce each other rather than cancel out. Empathic resonance functions similarly, stabilizing patterns rather than intensifying chaos. This is why some people seem to bring calm into tense spaces without speaking, while others escalate emotion despite good intentions. The difference is not character, it is state. Empathy as a field phenomenon is less about what you think and more about how regulated, open, and coherent your system is in the presence of another. When the nervous system feels safe enough to remain open, perception widens, and empathy becomes a form of accurate sensing rather than emotional fusion. This matters because fusion collapses boundaries while resonance respects them. And respect is what allows systems to reorganize without force. In this framing, every empathic moment becomes relational feedback, not a moral act, a physical one. You are tuning to what is present, and in doing so, you subtly influence the conditions in which that presence is held. This does not mean every moment of empathy changes the world. It means every moment of empathy changes the field locally, and local changes propagate when conditions allow. You may notice how this removes urgency from compassion. There is no rush to fix. There is an invitation to remain coherent long enough for resonance to occur. And when resonance occurs, something remarkable happens. Suffering does not disappear. It reorganizes. The signal shifts from chaotic to patterned, from overwhelming to intelligible, from isolating to shared. This is not about understanding pain better. It is about allowing pain to be met without amplification. And when pain is met without amplification, it behaves differently. It becomes information rather than identity. This is where empathy begins to act less like a feeling and more like a stabilizing influence within complex systems. Not dramatic, effective. And from here, the question naturally deepens, not about whether empathy matters, but about how such resonance scales beyond individual interactions into collective dynamics. Because if empathy functions as a field phenomenon, then its effects are not confined to proximity. They follow coherence. And coherence does not recognize distance the way we do. It recognizes compatibility, which leads us directly into the physics of how discord itself can change without being opposed. What follows from empathy no longer being private is a subtle but unsettling implication. because once resonance is acknowledged, isolation stops making structural sense, not emotionally, systemically. When a coherent state arises in one place, it does not remain contained there, because systems that share a field respond to stability the way water responds to stillness, by redistributing tension until equilibrium becomes possible. This is not mystical contagion, it is pattern behavior. In coherent systems, information travels with minimal loss, meaning the quality of a signal matters more than its volume. A single clear tone can reorganize an entire room of noise, not by overpowering it, but by offering a reference that other signals can align with. Empathy, when embodied as resonance rather than reaction, functions exactly this way. It becomes a reference frequency. You may notice how certain encounters linger not because of what was said, but because something in your system adjusted itself afterward, as if recalibrated by contact with a steadier rhythm. That adjustment is not memory, it is entrainment. In physics, oscillators placed near one another will gradually synchronize not through instruction, but through proximity within a shared environment. Human systems are no different. Emotional climates, collective moods, even cultural narratives behave like coupled oscillators responding to the dominant rhythms present in the field. This reframes influence entirely. Impact no longer belongs exclusively to those with platforms, power, or reach. It belongs to those whose internal states are stable enough to be legible to the field. Legibility matters. Fragmented states scatter signal. Coherent states carry it. This does not elevate the individual. It dissolves the hierarchy, because resonance does not care who you are, it responds to what is present. This is why small, seemingly insignificant moments can have disproportionate effects, while large-scale interventions sometimes fail to shift underlying dynamics. The system does not respond to intention alone. It responds to alignment between intention state and coherence. You may sense how this changes responsibility, again removing both guilt and grandiosity. You are not responsible for outcomes. You are responsible for conditions, and conditions scale. When enough individuals stabilize into empathic coherence, the collective field begins to reorganize, not suddenly, not dramatically, but persistently, the way temperature shifts before weather changes. This is why resonance is cumulative. Each coherent state does not overwrite the field, it nudges it. Over time, nudges add up, patterns soften, reactivity loses momentum, noise becomes less self-sustaining. This is not guaranteed, it is conditional. Fields reorganize when coherence outweighs fragmentation, and that balance is always in motion. What matters is that empathy embodied as resonance contributes to this balance without needing permission or visibility. It does not require agreement, it requires presence. And presence is not passive. It is an active state of regulated openness that allows information to pass through without distortion. You may notice how this kind of empathy does not seek validation. It does not need to be seen as good. It does not measure success. It simply remains available long enough for systems to entrain. This is how ripple becomes pattern, not by force, by persistence. And when patterns shift, behavior follows, not because anyone decided it should, because the field made different responses easier to access. This is the quiet power of resonance. It does not argue with discord, it outlasts it, which leads naturally to the question that often feels most uncomfortable. If coherence can reorganize systems without opposition, then what exactly happens to discord when it is met not with resistance, but with stabilizing presence? Because this is where compassion stops being a virtue and starts behaving like physics. By the time discord is noticed, it often feels entrenched, as if chaos has already claimed the territory, and only confrontation could possibly reclaim it. And yet systems rarely shift through opposition alone. They reorganize when a more stable pattern becomes available. In physics, incoherent states persist, not because they are strong, but because no alternative rhythm is accessible within the system. Compassion, when embodied rather than performed, offers that alternative, not as softness, as structure. This is often misunderstood because compassion is framed culturally as emotional warmth or moral kindness, which can sound passive in the face of real harm. But in coherent systems, compassion behaves less like comfort and more like regulation, reducing internal friction, so energy can redistribute rather than accumulate destructively. Discord thrives on amplification. Reaction feeds reaction, tightening feedback loops until volatility becomes self-sustaining. Compassion interrupts this not by negating emotion, but by absorbing without distortion, allowing the system to feel seen without being mirrored into escalation. This is subtle. So subtle it can be mistaken for inaction. But stabilizing a system does not require matching its intensity. It requires offering a rhythm that does not collapse under pressure. In the field, when two patterns meet, the one with greater coherence tends to dominate not through power but through endurance. This is why highly regulated individuals can sit in chaotic environments without being overtaken, while unregulated ones spread instability despite good intentions. Again, this is not character, it is physics. Compassion as coherence provides a container where discordant signals can settle, rephase, and reorganize into less destructive configurations. You may notice how certain conversations de-escalate simply because one person does not react in expected ways, leaving the system momentarily without a script. That pause is not emptiness, it is opportunity. Within that pause, the field recalibrates. This is where transmutation occurs, not as erasure of pain, but as a shift in how pain is expressed and processed. The frequency changes, not magically, relationally. In collective systems, this effect scales through what physicists call superradiance, where aligned elements emit a stronger, more coherent signal together than any could alone. When compassionate states synchronize, they do not cancel discord, they overshadow it, not by volume, by clarity. This reframes collective intention as something more precise than wishing or hoping. It is about creating conditions where coherent signals can reinforce one another, allowing the field to reorganize around stability rather than volatility. You may notice how this dissolves the urge to fight chaos head-on. Fighting assumes opposition, coherence assumes relationship, and relationship allows influence without domination. This is where compassion becomes transformative, not because it defeats darkness, but because it renders certain patterns unsustainable. Systems adapt to what they can maintain. If volatility is met with volatility, it persists. If volatility is met with stability, it either reorganizes or dissipates. Not immediately, but reliably. This does not guarantee outcomes. It describes tendencies, and tendencies matter. Because when enough compassionate coherence exists within a field, the range of possible behaviors shifts, opening pathways that were previously inaccessible. This is how reality changes without announcement, gradually, quietly, through altered conditions rather than dramatic victories. And once this is seen, the question shifts again away from whether compassion works toward how collective focus and intention interact with these dynamics at larger scales. Because if coherence can stabilize discord locally, what happens when attention itself begins to align? That is the threshold we approach next. There comes a moment after recognizing how compassion stabilizes discord when attention naturally drifts toward scale, not out of ambition but out of curiosity about how far these dynamics extend. Because once local coherence is seen to matter, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that attention itself may be one of the most under-examined variables in collective systems. not intention as desire, intention as orientation. In complex systems, what is attended to consistently begins to organize itself differently, not because attention controls outcomes, but because it alters conditions under which patterns form and persist. This is a quiet distinction. Attention does not force change. It weights probability. In physics, systems exhibit different behaviors depending on observation context, not because observation creates reality, but because it selects which aspects of reality become relevant within a given frame. At scale, this becomes subtle and powerful. Collective attention, when fragmented, scatters signal, amplifying noise and reinforcing volatility through constant reactivity. When attention aligns, even loosely, coherence increases, and with it, the system's capacity to stabilize without centralized control. This is where intention becomes less about wanting and more about being consistently oriented towards certain states, such as openness, regulation, and shared recognition. You may notice how movements fueled purely by outrage burn quickly, while those grounded in steadier attention persist, even when progress appears slow. This is not virtue, it is sustainability. Aligned attention reduces internal friction within the collective field, allowing empathic signals to reinforce rather than cancel one another. Here, intention functions as a tuning mechanism, not precise, not guaranteed, but influential. When many systems hold compatible orientations, the field responds by making certain outcomes easier to sustain, while others require increasing energy to maintain. This does not mean collective intention determines reality. It means it biases trajectories, and bias matters in non-linear systems where small shifts can redirect long-term evolution without dramatic intervention. You may sense how this reframes responsibility again, away from manifesting outcomes and towards stewarding states. The question becomes less about what we want the world to look like, and more about what internal conditions we are collectively willing to inhabit long enough for patterns to reorganize. This is why collective focus often fails when it is performative, episodic, or driven by urgency. Urgency fragments attention. Consistency coheres it. When attention settles into shared rhythms, compassion stops being reactive and starts behaving like infrastructure, quietly supporting systems that allow healthier expressions to emerge. This does not remove conflict. It changes how conflict moves. It becomes information rather than identity, feedback rather than threat. And from here, the most intimate implication surfaces. If collective states influence what becomes possible, then individual identity is not merely personal. It is participatory. Who you are being contributes to the statistical texture of the field, not because you matter more than others, but because coherence compounds wherever it appears. This is a tender realization, not empowering in the dramatic sense. Grounding. It asks for honesty rather than heroism, consistency rather than intensity, and it invites a different kind of participation, one that does not require agreement, alignment, or belonging to a cause, only a willingness to inhabit states that the field can recognize and reinforce. As this becomes clearer, attention turns inward again, not to escape the collective, but to locate where identity itself intersects with coherence. Because if intention biases trajectories, then the most influential question may not be what you believe, but who you are being at the threshold of interaction. That is where the field listens most closely, and that is where the next shift quietly begins. At this point, the question of impact turns inward again, not as retreat, but as precision, because once collective dynamics are understood, identity stops being a private narrative and starts behaving like a tuning surface, not fixed, responsive. Identity in this sense is less about personality or history, and more about the state you return to under pressure, the default rhythm your system offers when conditions are uncertain. This is where coherence meets embodiment. In complex systems, thresholds determine behavior far more than intentions, because small changes near a threshold can produce disproportionate effects. Human identity functions similarly. Who you are being when stressed, when unseen, when unvalidated, quietly determines how the field registers your presence. This is not moral, it is mechanical. When identity tightens around defense, certainty, or self-protection, the signal it emits is constrained, narrow, and reactive, even if the surface narrative speaks of care or concern. When identity relaxes into regulation, openness, and grounded awareness, the signal broadens, becoming easier for other systems to synchronize with. You may notice how certain people feel easier to be around without knowing why, while others create subtle tension despite good intentions. Again, this is not character, it is coherence. Identity, when understood as a state rather than a story, becomes the interface through which empathy enters the field. This is why practices that stabilize the nervous system often produce more collective impact than argument strategies or declarations. They change the interface. At the threshold of interaction, the field responds less to what is said and more to what is being embodied. This reframes self-work entirely, not as improvement, as calibration. You are not becoming better, you are becoming clearer, and clarity travels. In quantum systems, clarity of state reduces uncertainty locally, allowing information to propagate with less distortion. In human systems, clarity of being reduces relational noise-making resonance more likely without effort. This does not mean perfection, it means availability. Identity, when less defended, allows empathy to function as signal rather than burden, because it is not trying to prove itself or protect itself from the field. You may notice how this dissolves the pressure to act, speak, or respond constantly. Being coherent becomes contribution enough. Not sufficient for everything, but necessary for anything sustainable. At this threshold, the idea of responsibility shifts one final time. You are not responsible for holding the world together. You are responsible for noticing when your own system drifts into fragmentation and gently returning to coherence when possible. This is not control, it is orientation. And orientation is what thresholds respond to. When enough identities operate near coherence thresholds, the collective field becomes more sensitive to stabilizing signals and less reactive to fragmentation, not immune, responsive. This is how identity quietly participates in shaping shared reality, not through declaration but through presence. And once this is seen, the tension of living in a fragmented world while embodying coherence becomes unavoidable, because the external does not immediately reflect the internal, which brings us to the lived paradox of coherence itself. How to inhabit a harmonious state before the world appears to justify it. That is where this exploration now moves. There is a particular tension that arises once coherence becomes lived, rather than conceptual, because the world does not immediately mirror the state you inhabit. If anything, contrast sharpens. You may notice fragmentation more clearly, not because it has increased, but because your system is no longer acclimated to it in the same way. This can feel disorienting. Coherence does not anesthetize awareness, it refines it. And refined perception brings an unexpected challenge, the challenge of remaining present without becoming discouraged when external conditions lag behind internal shifts. This is where many people quietly abandon coherence, mistaking delayed reflection for ineffectiveness. But systems do not update uniformly. They respond unevenly through thresholds, feedback loops, and delayed phase transitions that are invisible until they are complete. In physics, a system can absorb change for long periods, with no outward difference until a tipping point is reached, and reorganization happens rapidly. Human collectives behave similarly. Coherence held internally does not promise immediate harmony externally. It creates preconditions. Living coherently in a fragmented world therefore becomes an act of trust in process, rather than outcome, a willingness to inhabit a state before it is socially reinforced. This is subtle work. There is no applause. Often there is misunderstanding. From the outside, coherence can look like disengagement or naivete because it does not mirror the urgency and reactivity that dominate collective discourse. But coherence is not disengaged. It is anchored. It remains responsive without being pulled into every oscillation of the field. You may notice how this changes your relationship to suffering. It is still seen, still felt, but it no longer defines the entire perceptual landscape. Suffering becomes one signal among many rather than the organizing principle of reality. This shift matters because when suffering becomes totalized, it drives systems toward despair or aggression, both of which reinforce fragmentation. When suffering is contextualized within a wider field, it becomes workable not because it is minimized, but because it is no longer alone. This is where hope changes shape, not as expectation, as capacity. Hope here is the capacity to remain coherent without needing proof, to stay regulated without certainty, to continue offering resonance even when feedback is delayed. This is not passive endurance, it is active stability, and stability is rare. Rare enough that when it appears even briefly, systems orient toward it, often unconsciously. This is why coherence must be embodied before it becomes visible. Fields respond to presence before they produce form. You may notice how this dissolves the urge to convince or convert. There is nothing to sell. Coherence is not persuasive, it is attractive. It draws attention without demanding it. Living this way does not mean withdrawing from action. It means action emerges from a different place, less reactive, more precise, less driven by opposition and more by alignment. From here, engagement becomes selective rather than compulsive, guided by resonance rather than urgency. This is how individuals remain humane in inhumane conditions, not by hardening but by widening. And as more people quietly do this, the field shifts again, not dramatically but detectably, like pressure changing before weather breaks, which leads us to the final integration. If coherence can be embodied, sustained, and lived without immediate confirmation, then a shared future begins to take shape, not as utopia, but as participatory reality, a reality shaped not by force or agreement, but by resonance. That is the horizon now in view. What comes into view now is not a conclusion, but a horizon, one that has been quietly forming, all along shaped less by intention than by accumulation of states that can finally recognize one another. A harmonious reality does not arrive fully formed, it assembles. It emerges wherever enough coherence exists to support it, first invisibly, then gradually through patterns that feel strangely familiar, as if remembered rather than invented. This reframes the future entirely, not as something waiting ahead, but as something already threading through the present, detectable in moments where interaction feels easier, understanding travels faster, and conflict no longer defines the whole exchange. These moments are not accidents, they are signals. In complex systems, new orders do not replace old ones immediately. They coexist, overlapping until the conditions favor one more than the other. Harmony, in this sense, is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of enough coherence that suffering no longer dictates the system's identity. This distinction matters. A harmonious reality does not eliminate pain. It changes how pain moves. It becomes shareable without becoming contagious, intelligible without becoming overwhelming, meaningful without becoming total. This is what universal coherence allows, not perfection, integration, empathy functioning as a field becomes the connective tissue that allows disparate experiences to remain linked without collapsing into uniformity. Difference remains, but difference stops being destabilizing. It becomes informative. In this future, action still matters, but it arises from attunement rather than urgency, from resonance rather than reaction. Responses become more adaptive, less polarized, because the field itself supports regulation rather than escalation. This is not guaranteed, it is conditional. Harmonious reality depends on participation, not agreement. It does not require everyone to see the world the same way. It requires enough coherence that systems can tolerate difference without fragmenting. You may notice how this removes the fantasy of saving the world. There is no singular act, no decisive breakthrough. There is only ongoing participation in conditions that allow healthier patterns to emerge. This is quieter than revolution, more persistent, and far more difficult to co-opt, because coherence cannot be faked for long. The field detects what is embodied, not what is declared. As this becomes clearer, responsibility settles into something gentler and more precise. You are not asked to carry the future. You are asked to inhabit the present in a way that does not add unnecessary noise to the field. That alone is contribution. When enough people do this, the collective environment changes, not because anyone planned it, but because systems adapt to what is most stable and available. This is how shared reality evolves, not through control, through resonance. And resonance grows wherever empathy is allowed to function as more than a feeling, wherever coherence is valued as much as conviction, wherever recognition replaces persuasion. You may sense that this future is not distant. It is unevenly distributed across moments, relationships, and systems, appearing wherever conditions allow. The question then is not whether such a reality is possible. It is whether you recognize the ways it is already trying to form through you, through others, through the field itself. Because harmony does not announce its arrival. It stabilizes quietly, and once it stabilizes, it becomes very difficult to unsee. As this transmission settles, what remains is not an instruction, not a conclusion, but a gentle reorientation toward how reality has been speaking all along, not loudly, consistently. You were never meant to carry the weight of the world as a problem to solve. That burden was an artifact of separation, of believing suffering lived somewhere outside the field you already inhabit. What begins to dissolve now is the idea that healing must arrive through force, urgency, or constant effort. Instead, something simpler reveals itself. The field responds to coherence the way water responds to gravity, naturally, without argument, without drama. Empathy understood this way is no longer exhausting because it does not require you to absorb pain into identity or transform yourself into a container for everything unresolved. It allows you to remain present without collapsing, and presence changes things, not immediately, not predictably, but reliably. You may notice that the world does not suddenly feel lighter. What changes is how much of that weight you mistake as yours. Suffering is still seen, still felt, still acknowledged, but it no longer defines the entire terrain of perception. There is room again, room for nuance, room for regulation, room for response instead of reaction. This is where coherence lives, not in transcendence, but in relationship. The field does not ask you to be perfect. It responds to sincerity of state, to moments where fragmentation gives way to enough stability for resonance to occur. Those moments matter more than they appear to. They accumulate quietly across systems you may never see. This is why recognition is more powerful than motivation. You do not need to be convinced. You need to remember what it feels like when things align without force. That memory is not abstract. It lives in the body and breath, in the subtle relief of not needing to harden, to remain engaged. From here, participation becomes lighter. You contribute simply by staying coherent where possible, by allowing empathy to remain a signal rather than a burden, by trusting that the field knows how to reorganize when conditions allow. Global suffering seen through this lens is not an unsolvable failure. It is a signal, a call toward coherence that has been misunderstood as a demand for control. And as that misunderstanding softens, something else becomes available, not certainty, orientation. You are already part of the field that responds, already influencing conditions through the state you inhabit, already contributing more than you were ever taught to notice. Nothing more is required in this moment, only recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, does not leave you unchanged. It simply returns you to what was always moving through you, quietly, reliably. Together,